Hello, this is Anne DeGheest. It's September the 24th, and our COVID video update this month is to boost or not to boost. That is the question. So hang in there because we're going to look at the data and find out, like the scientists, why there was so much confusion between the CDC, the FDA, and the scientific people this week. So hang in there. We have a lot to cover. A lot of happens in the last months. The good news, CDC has come out with a research showing that 83% of Americans over the age of 16 have some form of immunity. The Pfizer Booster finally got EUA FDA approval in the middle of last night. But only for some people. So we're going to cover exactly who can have access. There are 3 new oral drugs in phase 2 and 3 clinical trials that can be used as soon as you're infected, and we should get the results in the coming months. 44% of the global population got at least 1 dose, which is astonishing. And California has the lowest case rate in the US, and we'll talk a little bit about why. On the bad news, there is a plateauing of the wave, but it's still pretty high. And you're going to see the UK had the plateauing too. So we need to go down after the plateau. We're going to do a deep dive on all the data has been published recently on the vaccine efficacy and look at Pfizer, Moderna, and AstraZeneca and, why the scientific community was so confused in the last few weeks. We're going to talk about a new analysis that just came out on 5 million patients from Medicare and looking at the breakthrough case analysis and how that's being affected by the vaccines weaning off over time. There's a true correlation between high hospitalization rate and the lower vaccinated state. And unfortunately, it's leading now to official case rationing in a lot of the states that are affected there. And unfortunately, it's affecting all patients, not just people with COVID. The ugly is that 1 in 500 Americans have died from COVID. It is now the deadliest disease in US history, with over 685,000 people that have died, which is a staggering number. And there's unfortunately a pediatric outbreak. And of course, because so many kids don't have vaccination yet, and it's now up to 26% of the weekly cases. And of course, you expect that as the school reopens. So let's take a deeper dive. So let's look outside the US for a few slides to see any lessons to learn. And this is the thing that's a bit worrisome. You can see the Delta, attacked England, and then they had that drop like what we're seeing right now. But then they're basically plateauing. They're having a hard time going back. And you look at France, Netherlands, and Portugal, I just picked some of those, and you can see they had that big up, but then they're really all coming down to low rate, which is what we want to see, is that low level we had during the early summer. The UK is totally dominated by, unfortunately, Delta, who is, as we know, 100 times or 1,000 times more infectious than the original variant. So let's take a look at more of the data from overseas. The Delta is driving faster hospitalization. You can see the US now is not as high as it was during the worst part in last winter there, but we're having a good news. We're having a decrease on hospitalization there. Israel has also a bit of a plateau there, and then UK has that plateau. I mean, that's the one we know. We want to make sure we continue to go down, that we don't have this Delta spreading all around the community in the few places there that have not been hit yet. So new death per 100,000. Malaysia is having a big outbreak. You can see that, but this is what we don't want to see. The US is still steady heady on the per 100,000 cases. So this is population adjusted there, it's still climbing up. And then Brazil, has done a good job in decreasing. They had this huge peak, if you remember, in April there. So some progress in the world. On the new variants of interest, you may have heard about what's called the mutation there. The mutation there is that kind of yellow color. And it's really coming out of Colombia, which is 39%. You can see the Delta is squeezing it out. So the good news is Delta may be so infectious that mood cannot take a strong positions there. But also you can see it in Chile and some of the South American countries there. And then there's a new one that people are keeping an eye on called C12 from South Africa. Concern there, it has an extremely high mutation rate, and it could cause more severe COVID based on some of the mutation there. But again, these are variants that are not in the US in any significant manners. On a worldwide basis, 44% of the global population have at least received 1 dose. That's 3.5 billion people. That is incredible. that we as people all around the world have been able to act so fast in a short period of time. I mean, it's less than a year ago that the first vaccine was approved. And you can see the slowdown right now is totally tied to what's happening in Asia. One of the problems we're having with the data is the Chinese government is only releasing data on a weekly basis. You can see these big swings there, so which kind of makes the data not the most reliable. If you look at the dose given in the world, Israel, which is total dose per 100 residents. So if you're giving 2 doses, which is the Pfizer, the Moderna type, you expect 200 there. And then we have Belgium is doing really great. They start after the US, but down there, one of the highest at 72% of the population is fully vaccinated. And remember, they cannot do the kids. So it's a very high percent of the available population there. And then we have the US, which is ranked 43rd in the world. And it's really sad because we were, if you remember, a couple of months ago, one of the highest amount of vaccination in the early days. We really took most of the vaccine before it was available in Europe and other parts of the world. But then we have that resistance there where around 46% of the population, doesn't want to or doesn't have access to a vaccine yet. So what does that mean? In the US, the Delta has plateaued. I talked to you a month ago, we were at 156,000 at the time. That was around here. And now, we pretty much plateau. So we have to see if it continues to go down, like what happened to France, or if we, have the problem of the UK where we cannot go back to normal there. The bad news is our mortality rate is 2,000 a day. And that is terrible. That is a lot of people dying. And that's why we're around 685,000 people who have unfortunately passed away. On the fully vaccinated, we're still kind of stuck at that 55%. Good news, 65 and up, and we'll talk more about what does that do to the Medicare population, have been fully vaccinated. So we have high protections for the people who are the most at risk. Now we have some outbreaks. Alaska this time. Last time we had, Mississippi and some of the Southeast states. So let's take a quick deeper dive. This is a 4th wave. When I talked to you, we were at 46 per 100,000 people being infected. Now we're 38. So it's a bit of a drop, but it's not as low as we wanted to see it. And then you can see a big increase. Wisconsin is clearly having a bit of an outbreak at 82% the last 2 weeks. Montana, Alaska, as I've just mentioned, is having an outbreak there. And pretty much all the states that we're kind of isolated a little bit there, this virus is really spreading everywhere. I mean, nobody's protected. Montana, Vermont, all of that. You can see an upswing. Iowa, you're going to see there is having a huge problem in the hospitals. There is unfortunately a pediatric outbreak. And that's really bad news because 26% of the weekly cases are pediatric cases. And of course, that's being driven by the school reopening there. It's a 2.4x increase over July. And so I suspect we're probably going to get a bit more in October as, we go through the whole school transmission across the country there. We've had 5 million pediatric cases. Good news is low mortality rate, but still you could have between 2 to 4% of people being hospitalized. In Georgia, 60% of the outbreaks are from K to 12 schools. Now remember, some of those states don't want mask and they ban a lot of those protection mandate there. And I think you can see the outbreak as a result of that. Pennsylvania has 10 times more weekly pediatric cases than a year ago. If you compare the rates as of September of 2020. Unfortunately, Delta is worse for children versus the original mutation that we had. And so the data just came out that it increased the infection rate by 10x for infants. And unvaccinated teens are now hospitalized 10 times more than vaccinated teens. So if you're teens, you're not indestructible. You can get vaccinated. You can get hospitalized there. And you can really see the trends upwards that is now at the level that we were during the worst time, which was the last winter there. So unfortunately, you can see now more children and teenagers are being infected, which therefore drives higher hospitalization. Clearly, the Delta is having a stronger impact than the prior variants. If we look at the states and do the correlation between hospitalization and vaccination, let me kind of walk you through this. In green is the vaccination level. Lighter is low vaccination. Very nice green, I call the grass green, is the higher vaccination rate. And then in purple is the hospitalization rate. And you can see that around a third of the US population is in the dark purple, which is low vaccination, high hospitalization. And then you have another third, which is on the coast here, that are into the light green, high vaccination, low hospitalization there. But again, you can see this whole area there. And of course, there's something going on in Oregon, in Idaho, where they're having a much stronger hospitalization rate there. And one of the worst places is in South Carolina there, where 38% of the patients are COVID patients out of 100 beds in the hospital settings. So another way to look at the graphic there is to look at the amount of patients admitted that in a hospital there per 100 beds. So it's kind of normalized versus the share of the population fully vaccinated. And it doesn't take a PhD in mathematics to see there's a very strong correlation between high vaccination and low hospitalization versus the reverse, low vaccination, high hospitalization there. And of course, Arkansas, Texas, this whole area there is one of the worst places. And it ties to the percent of the population that's fully vaccinated, and it's exactly the reverse on the hospital being stressed. It's clearly a flip-flop of each other there. Texas, Tennessee, the whole Southeast is having a huge amount of availability. People are being airlifted to different states. A reality check, it's unfortunately a very sad milestone. We know officially COVID-19 is the deadliest disease ever in the history of the United States. We've now passed over 685,000 people. To give you a comparison, the pandemic in 1918 had 675,000 people who died. Now, to be fair, that was only a third of the population of the US now, but it's still on the absolute numbers, there were more people who have died. And the Civil War was only 620,000. So I know we're all getting numbed, and numbers are numbers. So there was this beautiful event a week ago in Washington, DC, where they put a flag for every person who died. And it was this ocean of white flags, just to give you the magnitude of, unfortunately, the loss we had in the US. We have had a 10-time increases in the last 2 months. So the problem with this variant is that you have this huge outbreak in a period of 3 months. So we think we were out of the woods, and of course we want to make sure that we don't have another mutation coming and starting this all over again. The other bad statistics is 1 out of 500 Americans now has died of COVID. And we're going to break these down into different subsections there, but that's a very sobering number. Whoops. And it's very different by ages. So it's 1 out of 85. Now you could make the case these are more elderly, so they were at high risk. In the 65 to 84, it's 1 out of 150 people. And in also the Native Americans, they got hit, significantly more than the white population. Look at this ratio: 1 per 1,300 to 1 to 400 there. So it's like 50 times. Worse there. And of course, the Hispanic, and that because a lot of the Hispanics were the essential workers, but it also correlated, with the mortality rate. If we look at fatality per 100,000, there's several states who are now a new high versus where they were during the last winter: Florida, Mississippi, Louisiana, Texas, Tennessee. And so, although the country as a whole is plateauing, we're still having problems in the hotspot states. To give you another perspective is that depending where you live, you have a different fatality risk. California has a risk of 1 per 590. Remember, the US as a whole is 1 per 500. If you're in Hawaii and Vermont, you can pretty much enjoy your drinks there and relax. But then if you're in Mississippi, New Jersey, Louisiana, and New York, remember we had this huge outbreak in March of 2020. But now Mississippi, Louisiana, and Arizona are in the same rate that what happened in New York. And that's recent. That's in the last couple of months. So why is that? Delta is the bad guy. I mean, it is 97 to 99% of the cases. And that famous mu is 0.1%. So the good news or the bad news, depending how you look at it, is that Delta is so contagious that mu is not able to get a footprint, which is a good thing because mu is avoiding the antibodies. So this is another graphic we don't like to see, which is if you only look at serious and critical cases, as opposed to people are getting infected and they recover at home, we are at one of the highest level. We are plateauing there in the number of cases that are serious and end up in a hospital settings there. So we need to get this curve going downwards. It's going up, but remember, we had all this yo-yo before. So the trend is not clear yet. So as a result of that, the hospitals are overwhelmed and they officially are now rationing care. And they call this the crisis standard of care, which means they pick and choose the patient that can get a bed in the ER or the ICU, and they give a lower level of care because they don't have enough nurses or equipment. And that's specifically targeted to Idaho, Alaska, Montana, Nevada, and Oregon. And remember, it's not just for COVID patient. One of my neighbor here, is 98 years old. He unfortunately had an event, and he was denied 3 hospitals, Stanford and another local hospital there. He passed away in the 3rd one. But that means it can affect all of you. If you have a car accident, or myocardial infarction, surgery, all of those things is affecting everybody there. A thing that has really changed is that a year ago, all the medical workers were treated as heroes. Now they are being attacked. And there's a very strange thing going on in some of these low vaccination states, is that they are aggressing the clinical teams. They are threatening them of death threat. They physically remove people from the ICU to give them ivermectin at home. I mean, it's the Wild West there. And as a result of that, there's hopelessness and anxiety. And the problem is that means that these people cannot give you the best care like they used to do. And one of the reasons is that if you're seeing 4 to 5 times higher fatality rate per week in the ICU there, I mean, you spend all your energy trying to save this patient, and then basically you have several deaths per day as a nurse. I mean, that is extremely hard. And they call this empathy fatigue, their ability to really care and for the patient that is being affected there. And we have some of the highest higher hospitalization level, and it's all correlated to people who have low vaccination rate. As I've just shown you there, you can really see those states there are the ones that have the problem there. And to give you an idea, in Iowa, I just pick one place there, look at the hospitalization. This is higher than during the last peak. And of course, ventilators, same problem there. So they're trying to get equipment or basically moving people to other state. We're having a similar problem in California here, where we're having an outbreak in the Central Valley, and they're airlifting all those patients into the San Francisco Bay Area or Los Angeles. So at time we are full here, not because we have high case from the Bay Area, but it's because they're airlifted to hospitals that have capacity. So the good news, the positivity rate is dropping. We wanted to see it all the way here, so we have a bit of room to go there. And so, but at least it's going in the right direction. Unfortunately, the vaccination daily rate is slowing down, and we still need to get people vaccinated. So as long as you get 40 to 45% of the population that's not vaccinated, Delta will continue to spread and will go through the whole community. So why is California having the lowest rate? And that's because 82% of people over the age of 12 got at least 1 dose. So the virus has no place to go, except for that Central Valley I was just describing there, where they're being airlifted to the part that has capacity in the hospital there. The good news is what's called reproduction rate. Remember, a reproduction rate of 1 is when the infection is kind of steady. Basically, one person infects another person there. In this case, we're at 0.69, and that's what we want to see. That's when the virus doesn't find a body because it's vaccinated or has antibody to spread out, and that's why you see the big drop in California. So this light at the end of the tunnel, I need to be optimistic. This is a beautiful graphic from an underwater cave in Mexico there. So let's take a look at some of the good news that has happened. The CDC just came up with a study there showing that 83% of Americans over the age of 16 have some immunity. That's why we're seeing all this outbreak in the pediatric cases, because most people over the age of 16 have vaccine, or they have some what's called antibody seroprevalence there from a prior infection. Now remember, those things do go down with time. So if you got infected a year ago, that doesn't mean you're protected now. So you still need to get vaccinated. And this was done by looking at all the blood that was collected across all the states. So it's millions of blood samples there. And it covered roughly 74% of the population there. So it's a huge sampling there. So it is also estimated that the number of infection, therefore, is undercounted by a factor of 2. So if we have 44 million official cases, in reality, we may have had 88 million of cases. That's probably the best way to really measure a population there, is to do the analysis of the blood. To give an idea, they broke it down by age. And this is really fascinating. So what you see is the seroprevalence, which is combined between the vaccination in people who were infected there. You can see that the young population are the people who had the most amount of infection there, as opposed to the elderly. But the vaccination, of course, combined is the highest, because you have such a high percent of the people of the age of 65 who were vaccinated. If we do it by race, again, confirm some of the things we've seen in the past, which is the Hispanic population is the one that had the highest infection rate as a percent of the population there. So you have roughly around 25 to 30% of the Hispanic population has antibodies. And then, the Hispanic Asian have the best combination because of the vaccination there. So the interesting part, you can really confirm what we've been talking about, which is just the younger population being infected and the Hispanic and non-white. So good news, what we really need is not for you to wait to be in the hospitals to be treated with monoclonal antibody at $2,000 a shot, is to really get you a drug that you can take at home as an oral pill, an antiviral to decrease the risk that you end up in the hospitals, that you can take this right away. So think about like Tamiflu. So Tamiflu, as most of you know, kind of decrease the amount of infection that's spreading through your body there. It's an antiviral, and the idea is that you take it really quickly. A first sign of infection was a matter of a few days. And you take it at home, so you don't have to get an IV, because the problem of remdesivir, which has been approved, it is only intravenous and it's only given as a result of that in the hospital setting there because of the issue there. The good news, it just came out a couple of days ago that if you end up in the hospital, you really shouldn't need to demand that, because it decreased by 87% the reduction of severity and death in the hospital setting there. Now, what we want is those products. There's 3 drugs coming up. There is one from Merck called molnupiravir. I'm not sure I'm saying this right. And what it does is that it's an enzyme that stops the virus to copy itself, and it makes so many mistakes. It's like a hacking, if you think about it. And that virus is not able to reproduce. Some of the other types are basically they boost the immune system to block the receptor so that it doesn't enter the cell. So there's like different mechanism of action there. There's an early trials that has the results, and it shows a very quick decrease of the level of infectious virus, what we call the viral load, the amount of virus that's inside your body there. And that's what we want to see, because you want your body to be able to stop it, quickly act before you get the cytokine storm that gets you into the hospital setting. The good news is that they start the enrollment of their trials, and expect the results by the end of the year. The problem is that the trial is structured to only enroll newly infected people who are unvaccinated. And these people are refusing to go in the trial because they don't trust science and they don't trust pharma, which is like hard for me to understand, but it is what it is right now. We live in a new world. The Biden administration had about 1.7 million treatment there for 1.2 billion that they hope to be able to get by the end of the year. So keep an eye on that because, as I said, COVID is here to stay, and we're all going to be exposed. And I'm going to spend quite a bit of time on breakthrough cases there. There's 2 more drugs who are not as far along as Merck, but they're still going into clinical trials, one by Pfizer and another one by Roche in partnership with FDA Pharmaceuticals there. So that's a really, really outstanding news. We've been desperate for a treatment that you can use at home. That doesn't mean you should not be vaccinated. You still get infected, and it decreases the amount of infection. And so vaccination is the best way to get that first level of response whenever you get exposed to the virus. So let's look at the Pfizer. Pfizer has released the results for 5 to 11-year-old children there. It's a lower dose. Adult is 2 injections at 30 micrograms. That's the 2 dose. And it's roughly 1/3 of the dose for the younger children there. They had looked at the antibody response of 2,000 children. So they did not look at efficacy, i.e. how many people infected versus people didn't get infected. They just measured the antibody response. And this is where it's going to be interesting to see how the science people at the FDA are going to respond to that, because they're saying, hey, we know it's effective on the humans. We just want to make sure that we're having a good response so we can correlate to that. So it's comparable to the 16 to 25-year-old. So we'll see how that goes with the FDA. When they look at the side effect, you may have heard that boys in particular can develop what's called myocarditis, which is an inflammation of the heart, which can be treated if detected. It is extremely rare. There's been several papers there. It's like 1 in 10,000 or 1 in 100,000. It's a very rare case. And the problem when you only have 2,000 children in a study there is that there's not enough statistically significant data to really know if it's protective there. But since it's a lower dose, you will expect a lower side effects. And really we need those because, as I explained earlier, there's more and more kids end up in hospital with Delta. And we need to let the kids be kids. We have to liberate them so they can play sports and they can go to school and they can, see their friends, and which they will do anyway. The other good news is that the data for children 2 to 5 and 6 months to 2 years, so there's going to be 2 different titration, is expected to come out at the end of this fourth quarter, with hopefully an approval at the end of the year or next year. So let's talk about the booster. This is the best part of the presentation. So hang in there. Thank you for being patient. So this is, I call this the messy soap opera. Whatever happened this week is really sad. A quick summary there. In mid-August there, the White House announced that every American after 8 months after the second shots will have access to the booster, not just Pfizer, everybody, with a target of September 20th rollout. And then a few days later, it changed to 6 months under pressure from the scientists from the FDA and CDC. And then it dropped to 5 months. And then the White House was told, forget it, just Pfizer. And you have to be sure it's pending to the FDA and the CDC. The FDA advisory board this week basically said, well, it's 65 and plus, not everybody, only high risk, but we only include the healthcare workers and the teachers. Next thing we know, the FDA approved an EUA, not a full approval, despite the fact that the vaccine from Pfizer is fully approved, for 16 and plus who are at severe risk. Next thing we know, the CDC advisory board, a whole bunch of scientists says, well, we don't believe the healthcare worker and the teacher and the other people. We only have the data for the 65 and plus. I will share the data in a few minutes. And then the good news is the CDC director probably said to herself, well, our job is not to wait for people who die in hospitals with nice clinical data to show that indeed they are at risk. We should protect the population. And she overrode, and I give her a lot of credit for that. And she says, I'm going to approve whatever the FDA has approved. So then we kind of go back to what it means. First, the FDA, why did we have this mess? One other thing you need to be aware is that there's no permanent FDA chief and nobody has been nominated. So we have an acting commissioner, which under federal law has to finish by mid-November. Therefore, guess what happens? You just ask for more data. This is the best way to punt anything. And you saw that with the vaccine booster for over 65, as opposed to make it available to people with Moderna, J&J, or anybody else. And they also punted on the e-cigarette regulation, which they were supposed to come out after years of studying it. So we have a problem with leadership at the FDA. And unfortunately, there's no person has been nominated or nor has accepted to be nominated because it's a tough job. So what's the booster status? And this is so complicated, so I try to simplify what's the status. So Pfizer doesn't have full approval, but it's an EUA of the same drugs that has full approval, so don't get me going. And it's available for anybody who's immunocompromised over the age of 16 and for everybody over the age of 65, roughly 6 months after you had your second dose. The FDA has also allowed the booster for healthcare workers, teacher, and daycare staff, grocery worker, and those who basically are at risk. So it's a very big population there. And then we had this, it's around 26 million people who are eligible. These are people who took the Pfizer, not the Moderna, the J&J, just the Pfizer one. It is expected, now that it's been officially approved last night, to be available at CVS, the healthcare provider. If you're in California, go to My Turn app to basically find a local place to get vaccinated there. It is safe to take at the same time that the flu shot. In fact, a lot of people recommending you took at the same time. And there's a ton of vaccine supply. There's no issue like what we had a year ago. But what does that mean to the other half of the population being included as the Moderna booster? Now, Moderna has been officially approved by the FDA under EUA if you're immunocompromised. Moderna has submitted to the FDA their data for the booster to get the same approval that Pfizer had, but there's no date expected to review the data. And one of the issues I'm going to share in a few minutes is the type of data they collect is slightly different than Pfizer. J&J has submitted, is going to submit to the FDA a request to do a second shot based on the data they've shown. And then there's this big controversy about mix and matching, which they're doing in Europe. FDA and CDC position, which therefore your physician will follow that, is that there is no safety and efficacy data in mixing and matching. European data is showing you get a stronger antibody response if you mix and match with it. There has been no clinical trials, and the US is much stricter in following data that they have done after the fact. So they recommend that you stay with your prior vaccine types. So technically, Moderna vaccinees are not eligible for the Pfizer booster. practicality. Over 2.3 million people already got a booster before it was approved. And that's because if you go to any of your pharmacies and all of that, there is no system where they control what you had, what you did, I know several people have declared that, that they immunocompromised or they need a third booster and they get it. So I just don't want to encourage you to do that. But I'm just saying, this was really a storm in a teapot here, which unfortunately makes the thing very messy. So let's look at the data so you can make your own decision. And why did all these scientists got confused? And so if we look at data from the UK, so they look at the effectiveness of Pfizer versus AstraZeneca, and these are the two vaccines in the UK, is that it is clearly winning for people of the age of 65 after 5 months. AstraZeneca dropped to 36% protection against infection and Pfizer to 55%. Now, the good news is that there's still a very strong protection against hospitalization and severe cases. So if we look at the data here, you can really see for the 16 plus of the whole population there, it drops for AstraZeneca at 47% and for the 65 and up to 36% though. So that's not good. That means you have a high chance of getting infected. And you can get infected, and still have a lot of problems there as opposed to, be on the ventilator. So I think we need to break down all the risk by the different subsegments. And the Pfizer, if you look at the population as a whole, is 69%, and the 65 and up is 55%. So you can really see that drop over time. So let's look at the data in more detail. In a period of several weeks, you can see AstraZeneca and Pfizer are declining. AstraZeneca clearly declining at a faster rate there. And unfortunately, that is impacting, therefore, mortality, much higher for our AstraZeneca than Pfizer. Pfizer is still at the 85 to 90% protection against severe cases. Now, another data came out, which is really interesting, is that Moderna has been measured to have 2.5 times more antibody than the Pfizer. And this was a study that happened in Belgium, and where they took 1,600 Belgian healthcare workers and they measure the antibody, and this is a logarithmic scale, so it doesn't look like it's a big difference, but it is a significant difference of 2.5x. And it was also correlated with aging, and so what they measured is that if you had no prior infection and took Moderna, you're around 2,881 units per mole, which is roughly 2.7 times, I guess, Pfizer. But if you had a prior infection, look at the extra antibodies that you have there. Now, remember, antibody is not everything, but it's clearly your first line of defense. Another report came out of JAMA there, where they look at Moderna versus Pfizer in the older population. And this is Pfizer and this is Moderna. So Moderna is in orange. And the good news, you can see the antibody really spiking. And they can see the difference when they do the boost, when they do the third shot. I mean, there's a drastic increase there. But there's a lower antibody in older adults. Our immune system doesn't kick in as much. So there's clearly a very strong correlation between the binding of the virus and the neutralizing antibody. And that's how you tie these pieces together. It's easy to measure the neutralized antibody, which is what Moderna is doing for its booster. And then you tie that to the ability of the virus to tie based on the amount of antibodies. And this is where we have to see if the FDA and the scientists, agreed with this. Another data from Kaiser, and is doing a retrospective study there. And what they showed is that after 4 months, so it's even earlier on the Kaiser database, it's American data, is as low as 47% at 5 months and 53% at 4 months. So that's a drastic drop of the protection there. And so the good news, it stays very protective against hospitalization. So basically, if I summarize the data so far, is that if you're over the age of 65, you probably have, after 4 to 5 months, you probably have a 40 to 50% chance of being exposed and getting infected. But you have a protection that you may get very sick there, but not necessarily have a severe case or maybe a mortality there. So why is that? Because the neutralizing antibody is the first line of defense. And it's not uncommon that you lose 50% of your neutralizing antibody every 108 days. It's kind of the way the antibodies work. And so what we see is this protection that I just mentioned there. When you start with a 90% protection against the mild case, and you drop to 70% or 50%, depending on the study there. And that's from Israel, UK, and on several cases from the US. Now, what's unclear is what's called the immunity reserve. And the immunity reserve is what really kicks in gear after a few days when you get infected there. And this is called the germinal centers there. And then they activate the memory B cells and the T cells that we have discussed in the past. And that's your second line of defense. And what the data seems to be showing in some of these studies that just came out is that you continue to increase those with time. So you can see the antibody are going down with time, but the B cells and the T cells are steady heady. I mean, they're still there to protect you, and we have no idea how long they last. The problem is that it's extremely hard to measure T cells in clinical trials. So it's not something we can do when you do a trials with thousands and thousands of patients there. So I think we need to be careful when we say, oh, my antibody are going down, I'm at risk. Well, we know that there's a correlation with antibody and clearly breakthrough cases. We've seen that, and I'll share that more. But keep in mind, you still have those that may protect you against the severity. So that we need to break down those two aspects. So data from the CDC now, looking at hospitalization, and clearly Moderna against hospitalization, not infection, hospitalization, has 93% effectiveness versus Pfizer 88% and J&J at 71%. So there's a differences between the mRNA and the J&J. And some of the delta there is really showing, you see the graphics there. Again, it's a logarithmic curve. So really, this is a big delta there. Clearly J&J has a lower protection there against hospitalization than the Moderna and the Pfizer. Why is that? It's based on your behavior. This is a Colorado analysis there where they look at 3,000 breakthrough cases out of 3 million people vaccinated. So it's roughly, around 1% if I do my math right. And you can see most of the breakthrough cases are the people who are younger because they're probably out and about, going into indoor restaurants, being active on the soccer field, and have a higher chance of being exposed. That the elderly population was still much more careful in their activity there. So it's age, it's what you do, and the amount of exposure that you get that can get you into breakthrough cases. And this week, there's this amazing data that just came out, which is probably what the FDA and the CDC use in their review, where they look at 5.6 million Medicare beneficiaries. And then they look, it's the best database we have in the country there, but it's only for people over the age of 65, which kind of gets me back to this whole controversy about only allowing booster over 65, because that's the only really big data they have. And what it shows is that they had 148,000 breakthrough cases of people who get vaccinated, which is roughly 2.6%. So out of 5.6 million elderly vaccinated, they had this, 148,000 cases. The good news is that the people that are being hospitalized was only 0.5% versus people who are vaccinated. Now let's look at the number, because I think there's a reality check. So there's clearly a decline with age, and I'll show you the data there. But the hospitalization rate a year ago for the people over the age of 65 was 32%. It's still 20% if you're vaccinated. So if you do get infected and you do have breakthrough cases, you still have a 20% chance of ending up in the hospitals. And the bad news is that if you're in the hospitals, you have a 34% chance to be in the ICU, which you really don't want to be on the ventilator. Good news, the mortality rate is lower, 2% versus 12%, because you have a better immune defense because you've been vaccinated. But still, it is a risk for the elderly population. So when you look at this data there, you can see what the scientists from the FDA and the CDC say. We can ignore this. This is really, how can you ignore 5 million data points? So let's look at the data here, because this is outstanding data. And this is a friend of mine from Metrics who work with the government to do this analysis. And you can see that the breakthrough cases are climbing up as the vaccination now is starting to wean off at 4, 5, and 6 months there. 73% of the people of the age of 65 that and the big Delta case were vaccinated. But that's, remember, over 80% of those people are vaccinated. So you would expect that pretty much all the cases, or a big part of the cases, are people vaccinated. But that means if you are vaccinated over the age of 65 and you are over 5 to 6 months, it is clearly a risk. So let's look at the data there. They compare 3 to 4 months, which is the purple here, to 5 to 6 months, and they look at the breakthrough cases. So what you don't want to see is the breakthrough case going up, and it clearly is. So at 3 to 4 months, you have a slightly increase over time, but now you have that big increase between really a period of 2 months is the Delta here, and that's a huge increase in breakthrough cases there. So clearly the protection is dropping at 5 to 6 months. So then they look at Moderna versus Pfizer. Both of them have breakthrough cases there. And so, it is clearly an issue, and they have the same problem there. So you look at the purple there, which is the Moderna and Pfizer there, and you can see at 3 months, they have the same problem, and both of them are going straight up. Clearly, Pfizer a bit worse than Moderna, but it's not a huge difference there. So then they look at the older cohort. Is there a difference by the age group? As you would expect, the older you are, the more you have a risk of a breakthrough case. Not a surprise there. Because our immune system is weaker and you neutralize antibody, we know faster. So if you have the odds of getting a breakthrough case increase by 2.5x at 6 months post. So and so if you had prior COVID, remember I've shown you earlier with the European data that you have many more antibodies, like literally 10 times more antibodies. So those people, they're pretty much well covered if they had prior infection and a vaccination there. But then as we go up there, this is what's called the odds ratio, which increased the risk there. And anybody who has kidney dialysis, which means they're immunocompromised, they're significantly higher risk there. Obesity, still a leading problem there. Because of the way it affects the response to the disease there. So it's clearly an issue with age. So I think when you see this data, you can see what the FDA and the CDC could not ignore the population over 65 because the data was overwhelming from all of the places. The problem in the US is that we don't really have the size of the data sets that Medicare has for people less than 65 because our data is parceled into a whole bunch of different places. It's in Humana and United and all of that. It's not one big database like CMS has for the people of 65. So we don't have high clarity by subgroups. And I shared you some of the data earlier there. And I think that's why you had this big mess this week. It was a scientist who said, give me more data so I can make sure. And the other people who says, no, it's very clear it's going down. It's going to go down on everybody. It's just the rate at which it goes down based on age. And so my crystal ball is that you're going to see the third booster being available in the coming months to the rest of the population. And we just have to work ourselves with the scientists. Another good news is that we talked several months ago about this MMR. I mean, the old timers would remember that. That's the measles-mumps-rubella. And there was this data where people look at correlation across the world with countries having lower rate because they had a high amount of MMR vaccination. And the data finally came out on Brazilian trials that, long and behold, people with 2 doses of the MMR have a 78% risk reduction in COVID treatment there and a 51% reduction of symptoms. So, so it is effective in decreasing severity of the infection there. Let's do a long COVID update. If you remember, long COVID is defined, and that's 2 different terms. They just came out in the government to call this post-COVID sequela, PACS. We'll talk about that in the next slide. And that's when after a period of 2-3 months, you still have a long-term consequence with damage to your organ that lasts for a long time. In the press, you may have heard about long COVID, which is you have persistent symptoms for 7, 8, 9 months now. And so the good news is that they finally decide, thank God for the government, to have a code, because up to now, we have no idea on how to analyze those patients there because they're not identified with a disease. So they got a new code that's only effective on October 1st, so that's coming up. They have been entitled to get disability right because half those patients there cannot go back to work. And remember, it's between 15 to 30% of patients that get infected, not in the hospitals, that get infected, will develop long COVID symptoms that could last for months. And it's severe chronic fatigue. And if you haven't seen that, I have mentioned that and discussed that in a lot of the prior videos. The good news, if you're vaccinated, you still have a 2.6% chance of a breakthrough, but then in a low case, it's 15%, in a high case, it's 30%. So it's roughly a 0.5 to 1% chance that if you get a breakthrough case, you end up with long COVID there. So it's a low probability, but it is still something to be concerned about. And that came out of an Israel study. So it's real data out of around 1,500 healthcare workers to see these patients who had problems. The problem is that it takes a long time to do these trials. So the government has decided under Francis Collins to give $1 billion to the NIH to finally research long COVID. And they came out and says, well, we don't know what the name is. We don't know how to call it. We don't know the mechanism of action. So we're going to do a big study. And they're going to enroll 30 to 40,000 patients. And in case you have that problem, go to recovercovid.org and you can enroll. It's done at 30 institutions across the country. And they're using a lot of digital monitoring and basically studying. It's not treating you, it's studying you. So it's a research. Here's the problem. There's a major flaw in this protocol, because instead of taking some of the hundreds of thousands of patients in the US right now who are fighting long COVID, they only want to get newly infected people. And therefore, it's very hard to basically enroll that, because they want people who didn't have vaccination, which is like, hello. But anyway, so I think we have to see what's going to happen to that one. So I think it's a time where scientists want to do good research, which may not be the best for the patient care, but we'll see. So, and again, these are the statistics reported by the CDC and the NIH that your chance of long COVID is 10 to 30%. And finally, it's being accepted to be a disease as opposed to being ignored. So data just came out. This is big breakthrough for people with long COVID. The big problem with long COVID is that they try to go up and down flight of stairs or walk around, and then they're wiped out. It's called, disabling fatigue there, where for several days they barely can do anything. And we've been trying to understand what's called the exercise intolerance. The worst thing you can do for these patients is to go exercise. You'll feel better. That is the worst thing you can do. And so they have developed what's called post-exertional malaise, which is you do a tiny bit of exertion and then you're just wiped out. And what they have discovered is that these patients, they have a problem in not the lung transferring oxygen, but the tissues inside your body extracting the oxygen it needs to be functional. And that is really a big issue there, because if you look at the control patients, they have absolutely no problem there. It's absolutely linked to these long COVID patients there. It's a narrowing of the connection between artery and mixed venous oxygen. It's a transfer of oxygen at the tissue level inside the body there. And so you have basically what's called reduced peak exercise aerobic capacity, which is the ability of the tissue and your muscle to extract oxygen as you're trying to increase your activity level. So if you're a runner, you hit basically the peak, and you have hit that problem in the past. We're talking people doing daily exercise and being absolutely wiped out. It means, therefore, it's a peripheral problem as opposed to a problem with the heart. And that is a problem because that means it's systematic across the body there. But at least the good news is the first time we've been able to measure why these people are having this massive exercise malaise, and that's they're having a problem transferring oxygen into the cells. And as a result of that, you see a lot of people hyperventilation. That would be, if anybody who has long COVID, keep an eye on that. So that just came out. The other good news is that if you're vaccinated, it decreases the chance of long COVID by over 50%. And that's a study that just came out of the UK on Lancet with 1.2 million people vaccination, similar number that we've seen before. So the risks are low. So I want to remind everybody that we still have COVID everywhere in the community if you're traveling. And I think you should use what's called the Swiss cheese defense. Vaccination is one part of the defense, but we have all these other things like keeping distance, using common sense, and then getting masks and good, hand hygiene. So you need to do more testing. The good news, the US is unfortunately way behind. A lot of Europeans are using American-made COVID tests, and we still have approval problem in the US. I'm not going to beat up on the FDA again. But there's now 3 companies providing antigen testing between $14 to $25. They've been overwhelmed, so there's a lot of delays trying to buy them on Amazon. Binax now from Abbott is one of the biggest one, and you can see the picture here. There's Illum COVID-19 home test and Quick View by Quidel. These are the picture of the other 2. They're fast, but they're not as accurate. So you really need to do multiple testing. The fact that you test negative doesn't mean that you are negative. So what they recommend is that if you do believe that you're at risk, or you were exposed, or you're coming back from a trip, you need to do multiple testing every 2 or 3 days, especially if you go to a dinner party or gathering, a wedding or something like that. You make sure you collect the sample correctly there. It's make sure that you swirl the sample in a nostril so that you get enough of a sample there, because otherwise, you're not going to test anything. And if infected is only 80% accurate, I mean, 20% of the time you may be infected, but it's going to give you a false negative at 20%. So it gives a very false sense of security for people who are asymptomatic. So when in doubt, get a PCR test. But again, they have now become more available there. Don't assume if you do it once, you're fine. Repeat it. Now, if you repeat several times, statistically, you will catch it if you're positive. This is something I shared last month, but I wanted to put back the link, and it's going to be on YouTube. It's a friend of mine who put this data based on the latest statistics, and you can look at your community. If you're in a high-risk community like Texas and Florida, and you have only 40% vaccinated, which is out of the Southeast states, and you're over 65, and you are that 6 months period post-vaccination there, and you're in a group of 20 people, which is easy to do in indoor restaurants, they usually hit that, and you're there for 60 minutes, you have a 50% chance of basically catching Delta. And what's kind of cool is that depending on your environment, you can change all of that. So last time I showed the California case, if I go outdoor versus indoor, and it's like a 0.05% chance. So use common sense in the community you're in and what you're doing to put several layers of protection as we're going on, even if you're vaccinated. The good news is the N95 are now available, so go on Amazon, look for the NIOSA approval stamp. Don't buy anything else. That's the stamp that you see typically on the side there. If there's a K95, avoid them because they're made in China and the standard of quality is all over the places. And so if you see anything that doesn't have a headband, so it's around the ear, that's not good. If you see anything that has fancy colors and all of that and decoration, that's not good. So right now, the N95 are back. They're available. They're like $1 a piece, go load up just before the winter. And I have listed on the website on YouTube, the list of approved names. So you can look by brand to see if they've been approved. And if you wonder why you somehow don't fit in your pants, these fancy pants that you have been on because we're all, in much more casual clothes, the average person gained 1.5 pounds per month. Some people gain 20 pounds in the last year. So don't feel bad. Now it's time to basically slowly get rid of it. To finish there, I wanted to put this chandelier, which was made by a nurse in Boulder. And she used all these Moderna vaccine vials and she attached them all together to be this really cool chandelier. So, I hopefully give us hope that this whole thing is going to quickly go back to a bad memory. So I want to thank you for listening. I hope this was helpful. If you haven't seen my last video of a month ago, take a look on YouTube there. There's a lot of very different information there about vaccination and the things you can do. So please stay healthy, get vaccinated, and get your booster shot if you can.